for a long time. Yeah. There was a period of time in my life where I didn't. And like, it's just hard to live like that. Like
Now, if you're insulin resistant, you will struggle to lose weight. True or false?
if you create a massive caloric deficit, you can almost reverse insulin resistance in 4 or 5 days.
Welcome everybody to another episode of IG Life with Astrid, your APD. I'm here today and we'll be joined by Adrian Chavez. We're going to be talking about a few things around nutrition myths and also a bit of a true and false challenge for Adrian. This is going to be very fun, very informative. He's a guy who's got a lot of different things to share with you guys and with all of us. So make sure you stay tuned until the end. And if you can't stay tuned, you can rewatch it later or you can tune later on my YouTube channel that will be there as well. Also, we had a previous episode on all things gut health that you must watch. So let's get to talk with Adrian. I hope you guys enjoy it. If you guys have any questions, put them down there and we'll try to answer it. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm so happy to see you again.
Yeah, definitely. It's always good to talk.
You are always such a sunshine, such a great, vibe, which is awesome to just chat with you.
Yeah, definitely. You too.
Well, I was reminding everyone that we have already done an episode on all things gut health, so they must go and watch that one. But now I have for you today sort of a challenge on a true or false. So the first part of the IG Live is going to be sort of telling you kind of a few statements, and you got to say whether you think they're true or whether they're false, and sort of give you why you think that the answer is. And then we may just go around a few nutrition myths that they're probably all over the place, and we just need to put the stamp on them and say what the truth is.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay, so let's start with the true and false. And the first statement is, you should avoid at all costs any food with MSGs. True or false?
False. That's just all made up. There's no issue with MSG. There hasn't been shown any risk with normal consumption. Yeah, that's just false. And a lot of that, some people say that a lot of that is kind of driven by some narratives around, anti-Asian narratives that kind of developed a long time ago, but there's no evidence that this is an issue for humans with normal consumption of MSG.
Perfect. Second question or second statement. You should worry about consuming saturated fats versus other types of fats when you are in a surplus or in a gaining phase. True or false?
True, definitely. So saturated fats are going to increase LDL cholesterol to a higher degree relative to other types of fats, and that may not be an issue in the short term for some people, but for others, that LDL cholesterol rise is going to be quite dramatic. And this is largely based on genetics. So, one person could eat a lot of saturated fat and have almost no increase in LDL cholesterol, and another will have a really big spike. And so overall, just to be safe, limit. But if you know that you have no response to saturated fat or a very limited response to saturated fat, then it may be something that you don't have to pay attention to as much as someone who tends to have like a higher LDL level.
Yeah. And I guess we also need to bear in mind that you got to look at the whole picture and why, what probably is the quality of the diet and the baseline of that person. Obviously, when you're in a surplus and you're gaining weight intentionally, you probably are trying to put all things in a relative balance. But at the same time, I guess it may be, the question probably comes that whether it's someone may increase the risk of, increasing their LDL cholesterol or their heart risk because they are increasing that saturated fats within a surplus, and it's not like they're maintaining the weight, they're actually putting on weight. But at the same time, if they are purposely resistance training and have a active lifestyle, probably it's a different story compared to someone who's putting on weight and their lifestyle is a totally different
Oh yeah, definitely. I would
scenario.
just, when we look at saturated fat relative to other types of fats, over the lifetime, like the risk of cardiovascular disease is likely going to be lower if you're consuming more polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats versus saturated fats. So, I look at, overall lifetime risk. If you're doing it in a gaining phase for 3 months, doesn't matter. LDO is a lifetime risk marker. So a lot of people don't understand this is higher LDL levels circulating over the course of our lives can lead to deposition of cholesterol in our arteries, which leads to a little bit of a blockage, can lead to, that's what can lead to a heart attack, and sclerosis is what it's called, which is like, heart disease. And so this is, we have to focus on this over our lifetime and less so in short periods of time. So if your LDL is higher for 3 months, not that big of a deal. If your LDL is higher over the course of your lifetime, that's when it's something that we need to just pay a little bit more attention to.
Totally agree. Now, next statement. You should avoid all processed foods because they're bad.
Yeah, good conversation about this earlier. Everything is processed. So unless you like go bite the meat off of a cow, like it's being processed into a steak before you cook it. Like that's processing. Now, a lot of us don't look at that as process, but that technically is processing. So of course there's a spectrum of processing from, what we would consider like natural whole food to like very highly processed foods where, the natural food is going to be corn. The highly processed version of that is going to be Cheetos with, added oils and flavorings and those type of things. So yeah, we want to eat most of our food in this lower minimally processed area, but even eating, a portion of your diet, as long as you're meeting your nutrient needs, as long as you're not over consuming calories, as long as you're providing all your vitamins and minerals and eating plenty of protein, having some of these ultra processed foods as a part of your diet isn't that big of a deal. Now, if you're eating so much of them that like the average American eats 60% of their diet from ultra processed foods, if you're eating that much, you're not going to be able to meet your nutrient needs. You're going to be eating low fiber, low protein. You're just not going to be eating a nutritious diet overall. And that's the issue. It's not that having a little bit of this food is going to be harmful. It's just the fact that you're not giving your body what it needs already. And then that food is not meeting your needs. If you're already meeting your nutrient needs and you have a little bit of energy that you still need to consume, and a little bit of that comes from, ultra processed foods, not that big of a deal. And, I think I eat, plenty of ultra processed foods as a part of my normal diet. And it's not, it's maybe 10%, 15%, 20% on certain days. But, we have to look at processing as a spectrum and not as a black and white. And that's really important in my opinion.
I like that you're mentioning that pretty much from what I can summarize is that all food fit in a healthy diet. The main thing is to watch the frequency and the amounts you eat on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
And also like quantity, quality, and everything is pretty much in the spectrum. And as you said, processing foods is something that you will find like even the apple you're eating is being in some degree processed because it's not like you just picked it from the tree. It's been picked up, it's been transported, it's been washed, it's been utilized, and it's had something
Mm-hmm.
more than just grabbing it out of straight from the tree. So that somehow has their man hands on it already, and that's already processed.
Mm-hmm.
Now the thing is, ultra processed foods that start like when we start talking about this in a more specific sense, when we look at added salt, preservatives, and an excessive amount of added sugars and saturated fats and things that make that food highly palatable, that is not just all these things added and all these ingredients added, but also that they become so yummy and you just want to eat them more.
Yeah,
that's kind of when it becomes a bit tricky because
Yeah.
it's not just the ultra processed, it's just that it also is highly palatable and it is inviting you to repeat and repeat and you want to have more of it, which
Hmm.
is the dangerous zone.
Yep, yep. And I mean, the spectrum, like for example, I mentioned corn. You go from corn to like corn tortillas are minimally processed, or like corn chips, for example, are going to be a little bit further along down the line because they add oil and salt. And then when you look at like a Cheeto, then it's a little bit of corn with a whole bunch of other stuff, and there's a bunch of different things added. So there's again definitely a spectrum, and staying on that left side of the spectrum is going to be more likely to provide you a more nutritious diet, a higher fiber diet, a higher protein diet, and just provide, a better nutrient, overall nutritious diet that's going to support your health over the long term.
How would you define ultra processed if you were to put a concept on it?
I don't. There's a technical definition, and I don't want to mess it up because I know there's like an actual technical definition. But I would say like foods that have been altered in a way that they don't resemble at all their original form, and there's been things added to them to make them, like you mentioned, more palatable, more energy dense, and so those couple of criteria I think will fit most foods. But people we get too hung up on the semantics and not paying attention to the big picture as much. Like it really doesn't matter that much as long as most of your diet is just, if you're meeting your needs, if you're eating enough protein, you're eating enough fiber, you're eating fruits and vegetables every day, you're getting more than 5 servings of fruits and vegetables every day, and you're not overeating on your calories. It doesn't matter how, the spectrum of processing versus not processed and the percentages. People always ask, well, what percentage is okay, and how, like, you can't ever figure this stuff out. There's so much like gray area within all that the things that if we focus on the things that we know we need to be doing in terms of eating a quality diet that's going to provide us what we need, from a macro and micronutrient standpoint, if we're doing that, like beyond that, I think we need to really get better, as a population, of just not worrying about all the minutia. Yeah, because I mean, most of the questions I get are about all these little things that like just don't matter. Like, if you're doing the things that I just mentioned a second ago, the energy and the protein and the fiber, and you're getting fruits and vegetables, and you're eating nuts and seeds, and just nutritious foods overall, which I mean that I got to give some classifications for that. To typically when I'm working with a client, we'll kind of put some different foods in these categories of like more nutritious foods. Let's just make sure we're getting plenty of these because they provide you, the micronutrients that you need. And then just let's not get too concerned about all of these other little things. So yeah, I mean, I would say just it doesn't resemble like the original food at all. And there's things added to it to make it more palatable. And those are really the things that you want to avoid.
I guess it would apply that 80-20 rule or 90-10% rule where, yeah, exactly what you're saying. It is pretty much focusing on the bulk part of your diet should be nutritious foods, filling foods that make you feel good and like you physically feel good eating them, not just like, obviously you feel good when you eat certain things that are very highly palatable and delicious, but if you overeat them, you probably won't feel very good over time if that is the bulk part of your diet, just because it's just got so many lack of nutrients that you start feeling lethargic, brain fog, and all of these things that probably happen over time when you fall into nutrient deficiencies. So it's basically just keeping it simple. All foods are allowed. There's no good or bad foods, but most of the times is thinking about the proportion of these foods fitting in your diet. If you're focusing on the bulk part being 80-90% of your diet being very nutritious, that extra 10-20% being soul foods, as I call them, and delicious, and they make you happy, just have them.
Exactly. I mean, I didn't for a long time. Yeah. There was a period of time in my life where I didn't. And like, it's just hard to live like that. Like you have to,
Yeah.
Like putting that barrier where you can never eat these foods, like just makes life hard. And it was hard for me to maintain weight, to be honest, because I'm active. Like I'm super active and I'm 6'1". Like I got to eat 32 to 3,500 calories. If I eat no processed food, I'm gonna lose weight, like unintentional weight loss, and lose muscle mass over time. And I used to weigh like 20 pounds less and wasn't as strong, wasn't as physically fit because I was very, very controlled with my diet, and I wouldn't basically eat anything that was processed and was super like I didn't do 80-20. I did 100-0 for the most part for quite a while, and I don't recommend that.
Absolutely. Now, let's move to the next one. Now, if you're insulin resistant, you will struggle to lose weight. True or false?
That is false. Like, I hear that so often on social media in every study that's ever been done. When they take insulin resistant people, they lose weight in the same way that non-insulin resistant people do. Like, insulin resistance doesn't make you weight loss resistant. Now, people who are insulin resistant may, for example, have less what's called metabolic flexibility. So those individuals may eat a meal and then they may get hungrier more quickly because their body isn't able to tap into fat oxidation and fat storage to provide the fuel between meals. And in some cases, they just may experience a little bit more hunger between meals for that reason, but that's not everyone. And when studies put people who are insulin resistant on a caloric deficit, they lose weight. Like, I just finished a presentation for a popular nutrition certification or a popular nutrition program that I went into depth on all this literature. It's very clear. Like, I've looked at all the studies that have been done over the last 10 or 15 years, like every study that I could find over the last month. And it's incredibly clear. You put people who are insulin resistant on a lower calorie diet, they're going to lose weight, and insulin resistance improves immediately. Like, because that caloric deficit is depending on how large the caloric deficit is. Like, if you create a massive caloric deficit, you can almost reverse insulin resistance in 4 or 5 days. And like, it's immediate. And it's insulin resistance is largely a response to energy availability. And so improving insulin resistance is just reducing energy availability by creating that calorie deficit. And that is what really just works for people. And it's not different than the general population. Like, the weight loss that occurs with insulin resistant individuals is exactly what we would expect with the general population as well. And there's no differences in like the weight loss that does occur when they go into a deficit.
I do have a question. So when we define insulin resistance, do you think there is different types of insulin resistance in the sense that, yeah, is the insulin resistance at the level of the liver? Is the insulin resistance at the level of the muscle? At the level of the, where is it?
We can't do this right now because this would be like an hour lecture for sure. Like, this is what I went into detail in this lecture. And everyone is a different response. So insulin resistance in the liver, in the muscle, in adipose tissue, they all have different effects. But when we're talking about insulin resistance, typically we're talking about muscle insulin resistance, because that's what leads to impaired glucose control, because the vast majority of our glucose is disposed of in the muscles. So when we become insulin resistant at the level of the muscles, that's what leads to impaired glucose control. When we become insulin resistant at the level of the liver, that's when we see like fasting insulin go up, as opposed to like postprandial insulin, where after we eat a meal, those are not insulin, glucose, those glucose levels will rise. But this would be a really complicated discussion if we start talking about each site of insulin sensitivity and how to address it. But generally speaking, when we look at insulin resistance, this is just, generally people who are pre-diabetic, they classify as insulin resistance. They kind of use that term interchangeably, and it just means someone who has like impaired glucose control. And those individuals are the ones like that respond, same way to a caloric deficit. And it's always going to be some combination of muscle, liver, and adipose tissue insulin resistance. And it's within the individual, it's really hard to delineate, because then you have to run really complicated clinical assessments to actually determine at what level someone is insulin resistant. So it's really challenging to do that, and most studies just don't have the capacity to do that. So it's we talk about insulin resistance more generally oftentimes because of that.
When we refer to women with PCOS that struggle with insulin resistance, Are we referring to the same type of insulin resistance that we are talking about now,
Mhm.
generally being muscle insulin resistance,
So
or you reckon
yeah,
it might be a little bit different?
it's the muscle insulin resistance, because what's happening is women, when you become insulin resistant at the level of the muscle, we put out insulin. That insulin doesn't have the same effect in the muscles. So in order to better control blood glucose, our pancreas will put out more insulin, and that results in what's called hyperinsulinemia, which is very high insulin levels. So like, let's say a healthy insulin sensitive person might have an insulin level of 5 or 2, and someone who is insulin resistant maybe in 20-30 range, sometimes even higher. And that really high insulin level is what affects the hormonal profile in women with PCOS. So it is typically going to be a muscle insulin resistance, but the underlying driver there is the hyperinsulinemia, because insulin is a hormone, and insulin has hormonal effects in the ovaries and contributes to, an altered hormonal profile as a result of the pancreas just putting out more insulin than it's supposed to counteract the negative effects of the insulin resistance at the muscle or elsewhere.
Absolutely. Now, next one. Eating carbs with plenty of protein and fiber and fat sources will help you manage blood sugars in diabetics and non-diabetics. True or false?
Definitely true. We definitely want to have balanced meals. People, I say this a lot, and people are like, "What do you mean by balanced meals?" That's what I mean. Having some, when you're having carbohydrates, make sure that you're having some fiber. Make sure that you're having some protein. Make sure that you're having, a little bit of fat in that meal. And if you do that, even if you're eating rice or, a very high glycemic carbohydrate, it will reduce that glycemic response, because protein, fat, and fiber all slow digestion. And so what they'll do is just slow the release of sugar into the bloodstream. So if you ate that rice by itself, there's nothing else to kind of interfere with the digestive processes, or nothing else to be broken down. So that rice will cause a really fast rise in blood sugar. But if you're eating that as a part of a balanced meal with fiber, protein, and fat, that's the formula for blood sugar management for individuals with diabetes or even without. And I mean, it's more of a, it's something that you really really want to focus on if you're diabetic, and something that you don't have to pay as much attention to if you're not diabetic, because someone who's insulin sensitive is going to have that such a high rise in blood glucose that someone who's more insulin resistant diabetic is going to have. So I don't do every meal where I have to do, have to have protein, fiber, and fat. Or I mean, I do every meal. I don't do every snack like that though. But I do recommend, everyone do every meal like that. And if you're diabetic, you even want the snacks to kind of have the protein, fat, and fiber, so that you're really keeping that blood sugar under control.
Yeah, I was gonna say probably someone in the comments is gonna come and say what that so it that means that I can have just fruit on its own, or can I just have, I don't know, bread if I want just to have a little bit of that without having anything else? It doesn't mean like you have to be 100% so dogmatic about it. It's
Yeah.
more like, as a general rule, overall, the majority of your meals can come with that combined nutrient proportion, carbs, fats, and
Yep.
protein, so that glycemic load and glycemic index goes down, and your insulin response is much more consistent and flatter than having huge spikes in your blood glucose. Pretty much, I guess, is what
It
you're
creates
trying to communicate.
Yeah, it creates a slower release of energy. So when you have
Yeah.
carbohydrates by itself, the energy, they get broken down really quickly and released into the bloodstream, and it causes like a big, load of energy at one time. Whereas when you have them with these other foods that slow digestion, they lead to a slower release of energy overall, and that it gives us a more stable source of energy throughout the day, as opposed to like a big dump in energy that goes back down, and sometimes can lead to us wanting to eat more, and feel lethargic, and those type of things. And what you mentioned in terms of like, can I eat fruit by myself? That's why I wanted to say that, because like there's nothing wrong with that. Like I just ate like 5 oranges right now, the little ones. But for me, like, I train hard. Like that's not going to do it. Like my blood sugar is going to go up a little bit. It's going to go right back down because, my body, I'm not over consuming calories or energy. And, my body has a place to put that excess, glucose for storage. This, for someone who's diabetic, you may not want to do that, but an easy thing to do with just a couple of oranges with some nuts, and that those nuts will provide you with the protein, fat, and fiber, and really, create that, a more balanced snack. So again, diabetics may pay attention to that a little bit more, but individuals who are not diabetic, who are healthy, who are active, it's not as much of a concern.
Next question. Okay. You should wear a CGM or continuous glucose monitor, even if you're a healthy individual.
Absolutely. Completely false. I'm so opposed to this. Like it's hyper focusing on a physiological process that's normal. So you hear people talk about like the glucose goddess or whatever. You hear these people, glucose spikes. Like people who are promoting CGMs use this term, glucose spikes. It's not a spike. Your glucose is supposed to increase after you eat carbohydrates. They're using that terminology to scare you, because when they say spike, you think, oh, that's bad. And when someone says that to you, when they say glucose spike, that scares you. And then that makes you say, I need to manage my glucose spikes. Now I need to go get this CGM that costs $300 a month. And that's probably the worst investment that you could possibly make in your health, is to wear a CGM. Like it's going to cause hyper focus on a value that isn't important in its own. Glucose, like our glucose numbers, without taking them into context, are not important. Like they're important in context. Like what is your average blood glucose level over 90 days? We can measure that with the HbA1c. It's like $10. Like you don't have to spend $300 a month to get this value measured. And they're also important in the context of like, okay, what are your triglycerides as well? How many, like, and so if you're eating, like, you can manage your glucose and get your glucose down low by eating a really high fat diet. But then your triglycerides are high, and postprandial triglycerides are associated with higher rates of every chronic disease known to man. So you're trading one risk factor for another when you're hyper focusing on glucose, and it there's no point in it. Like as long as you're consuming the proper amount of energy and you're eating an overall balanced diet, your glucose fluctuations, throughout the day aren't that important. And the reason that people want to make you think they're important is because that you get a lot of money for that. Like if this company's reached out to me, and they send me emails like, hey, if you promote our product, you get $50 for every one we sell. Like that adds up. Like you can make a pretty good amount of money. If I told everyone, hey, glucose spikes are the next best thing, and started wearing one of these CGMs, I could probably make thousands a month off that one company promoting that one product. And that's why all these people are doing it, but they just don't understand the science. They probably don't even care to give people quality information a lot of times when people are doing these, when they're promoting this type of stuff. Like truly is, like, in my opinion, the worst investment, like health investment, that most people can make, and they're so popular nowadays.
Is it worth it for diabetics, or you think it is still a better way to go about it for them?
It's worth it for insulin dependent diabetics. So if you rely on insulin and you have to dose your insulin based on glucose fluctuations, then yes, you 100%. This is probably one of the most life-changing devices possible for insulin dependent diabetics. For those who are not insulin dependent, it can provide you some information, but if you're focused on glucose control, you're not going to improve your overall insulin sensitivity unless you're in a calorie deficit, unless you're actually doing, exercising. And these things are going to improve blood glucose anyway. And you don't really have to monitor your day-to-day fluctuations if you're focusing on the things that are going to help manage the diabetes in the first place, because you can really, really improve those diabetic numbers really quickly and get out of that range, and then you're normal, and then you wouldn't have needed it in the first place. So it depends on, in my opinion, this is for people who are type 2 diabetic, that should be a clinical decision with their doctor. But from my overarching view, I think if you're not insulin dependent, it's probably not that useful. But a lot of these people who are diabetic, for some of them, they're not getting quality dietary guidance from anywhere else. So wearing a
Yes.
glucose monitor helps them to just like eat less carbs, and then they eat less calories, and then they like lose some weight, and they think the glucose monitor did it. But just practical dietary advice for that individual and support around helping them make nutrition and lifestyle changes would be a much better investment than them wearing a glucose monitor.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with that. And I think seeing patients in the hospital, like type 1 diabetics, definitely benefit from having that continuous monitoring on the blood glucose levels, because they know when they're having a hypo or a very high glucose levels, and then they can act upon that to utilize the amount that is been indicated to maintain that blood glucose in good levels for them.
Mm.
Because it's a safe to keep them in a good place. If they are having a hypo, they could probably die if there's no act upon that, and that can happen. I've seen people pretty much fainting just because they have a hypo and they didn't know they would have it because they had no idea.
Yeah, it's life changing for insulin dependent diabetics. And then these companies realize that, hey, we could just sell it to the general population, and just there's a lot of that nowadays, is medical device companies and testing companies who have a true clinically useful test or medical device, and then they just realize that they can sell this to the general population through influencers. And so a lot of them end up, a lot of these companies are selling testing and devices that really, like, they're completely worthless for the general population, but it's a revenue stream that, these companies, their goal as a company is to sell as much product as they can. So once they've exhausted the type 1 diabetic market, they're going to just go, they move on to the next markets that they can get to purchase these products.
Especially nowadays that there is a lot of people health focused, and like they have that fear mongering around to promote something to make it super healthy. You really need this to get to your goals, because if you don't use it, you're not going to get there. Your blood glucose if you have a spike, that's the worst thing that can happen for your weight gain. So you have to really keep your carbohydrates low, and so on and so forth. But let's move to the next one. So kind of coming with the blood glucose management and everything, do you think a low glycemic index diet is overrated or underrated?
Overrated, because if you're eating balanced meals, the glycemic index of the carbohydrates in that meal are going to be different than what that glycemic index is based on eating that carbohydrate by itself. So like we mentioned with rice, has a higher glycemic index, so when you eat that by itself, it's gonna cause your blood sugar to rise. But when you combine that with protein, fat, and fiber, that glycemic index goes down. The blood sugar response goes down. So I actually just did a review on that, and glycemic index didn't even show to improve blood sugar control. Really, it was the total carbohydrates. Like it only did when people were eating like 60% of their diet from carbohydrates, which I don't recommend most people do. And I know sometimes that's like if you're like an endurance athlete, for sure, but for the general population, 25 to 30% of protein, and then probably splitting the carbs and fat from there, I think is a good approach to maintain blood sugar balance. So in my opinion, the glycemic index isn't as important. Glycemic index of the carbohydrates you're eating isn't as important as how you're including them in meals. And if you're including them in balanced meals and it's a higher glycemic index food, it's not going to be that big of a deal.
Now, what about glycemic load? Would you make, like if we did the same statement, a low glycemic load diet is overrated or underrated? Would you still say that it's overrated?
Yeah, and I don't want to confuse people right now, because a lot of people don't know what glycemic load is. So glycemic load is looking at glycemic index, and then it's combining that versus the amount of carbohydrates that you're eating. So high glycemic load diet is going to be one that's included lots of high glycemic index foods. And so if you're doing that, you're probably just going to be eating a high carbohydrate diet in general, And then those carbohydrates are probably going to be very refined and not going to have a lot of fiber. So one of the main reasons, I mean, one of the main things I always tell people is just like, if you're eating plenty of fiber, like this stuff, you don't have to really worry about all this other, like fiber is what matters. And so, I think a lower glycemic load diet, for sure, there's great evidence for that, because it's reducing the proportion of carbs in your diet overall, I think is important, as opposed to like the people who are eating like 60%, in my opinion. If you're eating 60% of your diet in carbs, it better be high fiber carbs. Otherwise, in that case, you want to have like, higher fiber, lower glycemic index carbs. If you're eating less carbs in your diet, then you can have more, other fiber sources and other fat sources and protein sources to balance out that blood sugar. And it's not as important how high the glycemic index is on those foods, because you're eating a lower overall amount of carbohydrates. But glycemic load is important. It's really hard to communicate. I don't talk about it ever, because it's really hard to communicate what that is and how to actually follow a lower glycemic load diet. Like, in my opinion, these are more research-based terms that tend to confuse the general population more than anything, where that's why I say, like, let's just focus on fiber and consuming higher fiber carbohydrates, and just making sure you're getting enough fiber in your diet overall. And if you're doing that, you're probably eating lower glycemic load foods, or overall lower glycemic load.
Absolutely. Last one in this category of true and false, your microbiome composition can be the main cause of your weight gain.
Oh, that's false. Yeah, that's false. The study that was done, that a lot of people cited, that said that your microbiome like influenced weight gain, and people were saying like, oh, your microbiome could be the factor that's causing your weight gain. In that study, it was responsible for like 4% of the variation in weight. It was a very small amount. It wasn't, people just exaggerate some of these things. Like, that study showed that microbiome does influence weight, but it wasn't that big of a factor. But then people leave out that last part. That's the part that people always leave out when they talk about studies. They'll say, oh, turmeric helped reduce inflammation. By how much? Like, that's the piece that people always leave out, because they, it's just a black and white, simple messaging. But yeah, it not that big of a factor overall.
I agree. I think the main point is that there are, I guess, your microbiome composition will probably, like, if there are certain, I don't know, strains that will probably ferment a bit more the fibers, which obviously make more energy available for your body to utilize, versus someone else that may have a different strain that are probably not fermenting as much of the carbohydrate or the fibers you consume. That's why it probably reduces the energy availability of certain things. So that, I guess, that makes a slight difference between, like, if two individuals had the same diet and the same amount of carbohydrates and fiber, but they have different or slightly different strains or microbiome composition, and one has that one that is utilizing a little bit more fermenting and making more energy available from that fiber, that is probably make a slight difference in terms of energy availability between these two individuals. I guess that's the kind of the explanation of why might be some differences.
Weight gain difference in the rats, because I forget exactly how I think they implanted rats with like obese microbiome and a lean microbiome, and they saw weight changes over the course of their life, and it was 4%. It was like really small, and we just people exaggerate what that really looks like, and these small changes, they're clinically significant, but they're significant from a research and statistics standpoint, but that is different than like clinically significant. Like, does it actually matter in practice? There's a lot of things that show to be significant because of the way that statistics work and the way that research works and the way that the studies are done, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like actually significant in practice.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing that I would like to sort of ask is, when you think about these diets that are like promoted you should have a little bit more soluble fiber versus resistant starch. I think at the end of the day, either of these will have somehow a positive effect on your gut microbiome anyways. But do you think that there is any slight difference between the effects on fermentation or on the actual physiological effects utilizing or consuming more one type of fiber than the other when we refer between these two, soluble versus resistant starch?
Starches, yes, yeah. So the resistant starches, from what I understand, have been shown to, because they get fermented like they're highly fermentable, as opposed to not all soluble fibers are fermentable. So some soluble fibers are less fermentable, and so resistant starches, for what I understand, are more high. They're more likely to be fermented in the colon, and in terms of like increasing butyrate and bifidobacteria, resistant starches seem to be more favorable for increasing those bifidobacteria and increasing butyrate, which butyrate is an anti-inflammatory fatty acid that gets produced as a result of fermentation in the colon of these resistant starches and fibers. They get fermented in the colon and they can produce butyrate, and butyrate is a really important nutrient for helping to maintain a healthy gut, intestine, and especially in the large intestine, because it basically, like, it's pretty crazy what butyrate does. It like regulates gene expression and creates a more anti-inflammatory like profile of in the gut. And so it's really, really important, especially for people with like inflammatory bowel disease and those type of things, where resistant starches probably have a unique benefit there, as opposed to soluble fiber. The benefit of soluble fiber is more on glucose control and reducing cholesterol. So soluble fiber sources are going to help to bind to bile and eliminate bile, which bile is made out of cholesterol. So then the liver will increase LDL receptor expression, pull cholesterol out of the bloodstream, and use that to produce more bile. And so that soluble fiber will reduce cholesterol from that mechanism, and also helps to slow blood sugar release as well. So they have different effects, but in my opinion, if we're eating a varied diet and you're eating a high fiber varied diet, like I usually don't have people think about like, oh, am I eating enough, soluble fiber, and am I eating enough resistant starches? And like, are you eating enough fiber? Are you eating, enough whole foods overall that are going to provide, some of those resistant starches, which is going to be like cooked and cooled rice, cooked and cooled pasta, cooked and cooled oatmeal, or actually even overnight oats has a pretty good amount of resistant starches. And then things like legumes are really rich in resistant starches often. So, those are high in soluble fibers and, and resistant starches. And you can get, just different types of, people don't eat enough legumes. Let's put it that way. Like, that's one that, beans and lentils and those things, like, we need to eat more of them as a population. I need to make a video on that, because there's definitely, like, you get the resistant starches and fiber and some protein from those, and I think people just overall don't eat enough of them. But yeah, for the average person, you don't want to get too into the weeds about, am I eating enough of these things? But for someone with like IBD, for example, you may want to focus specifically on types of starches. So or types of fibers, and that's the only time I ever would like pay more attention to the specific types is if you're trying to reduce cholesterol, you want to eat more soluble fiber. And then if you have a GI condition, then fiber becomes really important, because sometimes fermentable fibers cause issues. So you have to delineate between fermentable and non-fermentable, and soluble and insoluble, because sometimes insoluble can irritate the digestive lining. So when someone has like a complex GI issue, then breaking down those specific amount of fibers may be important, or specific types of non-digestible carbohydrates. But for the average person, really just getting a varied diet and eating plenty of these things is where the benefit's going to come from.
I get this question over and over and over, in terms of, is there a specific proportion between soluble and insoluble fiber I should be aiming for? Let's say, is it more soluble than insoluble better, or is it more insoluble than soluble better? Like, just eat vegetables and fruits, and don't get so hung up on these specific proportions, because it really is not as huge importance as you're mentioning, as long as you don't have like any specific condition you need to be managing or correcting. as long as you are paying attention to higher fiber sources overall, they will have a combination. Most of the times foods will bring a combination of the different fibers in different portions. So just make sure you're having a variety of these sources and have your life easier.
Yeah, fiber is way more complicated than we give it credit to, because even within each category, like each food has a different, like slightly different type of fiber. So that's where I say just eating a variety of different plants, because that's where fiber comes from. If you're doing that and that takes up a decent proportion of your diet, you're gonna be in good shape.
Absolutely. Now, let's move to another segment, which is around nutrition myths. And I'm conscious of your time, so let's see if we can sort of smash this a little bit more shorter. But they are important, so I don't know. You say if you need to go, let me know. But if not, let's smash this question. So the first one is, what are some signs of accounts in a social media that you should be wary and cautious to follow or listen to?
Yeah, when
Some
people
red flags.
yeah, when people are speaking in absolutes, like this is bad, or this is a superfood that everybody should be eating, or everybody needs to go keto, like those are complete obvious red flags right off the bat. And then when someone's trying to scare you, like when people are using fear as a way to get your attention, like that's not worth it. Even if they're providing great information, which those people never are, like the anxiety that comes along with the information that they're giving you is worse than eating the unhealthy food that they're trying to scare you away from in the first place. So that, those two things, in my opinion, are really, really important. The third one is look at the people who comment and the people who follow them. And this is also, to me, in my opinion, this is more important for identifying positive accounts. But if someone is highly credible, they're going to have a lot of RDs, they're going to have a lot of MDs, they're going to have a lot of professionals following them. And if they're not, there's usually going to be, like, you'll see the comments and it's, wellness with, Mona or whatever. And there's a bunch of different, wellness accounts, but you see no professionals in there. Like, look at Mark Hyman's, account and look at his comments, and you're not going to see a bunch of RDs and other professionals in the comment section supporting their content. If their content is good, you're going to see qualified professionals supporting their content, because qualified professionals are better able to delineate between quality content and not quality content. So in my opinion, that's probably, because a lot of times, some of these smaller accounts, like if you just look at who's following them and who shares their stuff and who looks at and who comments on their stuff, like it can help you as a consumer to identify really high quality accounts. Because if it's a large percentage of RDs, MDs, other just healthcare professionals, you can be sure that they're not duping all of those professionals.
One thing that I believe is a little bit scary is having people who are already professionals and they have their degrees, they have postdoctorates, they have masters, but they have a very strong bias towards something. Like I've seen RDs that are 100% anti-fat or anti, I don't know,
Like
total intuitive eating, or just the keto RD or the low carbohydrate RD. So you see very extreme positions within the realm of dietetics or within the realm of medical professionals. So in these specific situations, I guess it becomes much more difficult to know, well, is this person reliable, or should I actually believe their content because she's a professional? How do I know whether this RD is actually telling me that calories don't count? Oh, like
so some, again, a lot of it's going to come down, like, even though they're a professional, if they're saying these types of things, they're not going to be followed by professionals. Like, they're not going to be followed by other RDs, or they may be a couple, but the proportion is going to be different. Like, go to my comment section and scroll through it, and there's, in any of my posts, there's like 30 to 40 or even 50, 60% RDs and MD, like it's people who are qualified in sharing my content, and that gives a good indication of like, okay, this person is a little bit more credible. In those cases though, those black and white things, like if someone's extreme or black and white about what they're saying, then that's always a red flag, even if they're a professional. So even if they're a professional and they're saying, you know, all they talk about is a vegan diet, that's a red flag. And even if you want to go vegan, like you have to understand that they may not be giving you good information. And so even if you want to go vegan and this person like validates, you know, your thoughts around that, it's still going to be helpful if you want to understand your health better to follow people who give a more balanced approach. Because I know, you know, people who are vegan, who are, you know, really strong proponents of a vegan diet, who will talk about some of the you know, nutrient deficiencies that can occur with you know, a plant-based diet, and also discuss, you know, some of the benefits of, like, you know, maybe some of the benefits of consuming dairy or other animal-based foods. And if they're unwilling, if they only talk bad about animal foods, and they only talk bad about vegan diet, or only talk good about a vegan diet, then that's a huge red flag. So you have to just be able to see the type of content that they're doing, and see, are they providing a balanced approach, or are they, and the bias is obvious. Like you for example, there's a guy, I get this all the time, Dr. Greger at Nutrition Facts. Like people will always reach out to me and say like, oh, is this guy credible? Like he has a MD and he's a part of a, you know, he writes papers and he's a part of a university. Yeah, those things look great on the surface, but if you just look at the nature of his content, anything he puts out is about how bad animal foods are and how great plant foods are. And when that is going on, there's bias, and you're not being educated. You're being indoctrinated. Like there's a difference between someone educating you and trying to provide you information so that you can make the best decisions for yourself, versus someone who's trying to convince you of a position so that you will do what they think is best for you. And you want to avoid the people who are trying to do the second part. If someone's not, if it feels like someone's constantly convincing you that this is the best thing to do, and they're not just providing education, you know, that's a red flag.
I think it is important to understand that people can have on their handle accounts, maybe they're specialized in a specific topic. Like we have vegetarian or vegan specific medical practitioners, but they provide a more thorough and balanced approach to nutrition or anything related to that particular topic. Whereas something that is totally biased and, as you're saying, is trying to convince you that you have to lead to that way because that's the only way to live healthy, long, and healthier. So I guess that is kind of the main point, is it's not just identifying what the account is saying, because you might find that there are specific terms or things that people use that are not necessarily 100% descriptive of what their content is like or what they're trying to communicate, but also see what people follows them. Because obviously if there's someone who is a medical practitioner who is a vegetarian or vegan, but has a good amount of people that you trust that person, that probably gives you a good indication that that person may be a good one to trust. But if there's not even one person that you find credible that follows that person, or there's, as you mentioned in the comment section, there is nothing that sort of tells you this person is really onto trying to help someone, but rather trying to indoctrinate you, then it's probably not a person that you can trust straight away. Maybe you need to monitor if you feel like there's some type of content that you think, oh, well, it doesn't sound too bad, but I'll give it a couple of extra
Yeah.
posts to see whether it convinced me.
I highly recommend, and I talk about this to my followers all the time, is like, you have to unfollow these people. You have to unfollow these people because, number one, you're confusing yourself if you allow multiple biased sources of information into your mind. Like if you're following Carnivore MD and then vegan, nutritionfacts.org, and you're seeing both of these crazy, complete opposite competing messages all the time, you will forever be confused. So like you have to really just unfollow all of these accounts that are not credible. And a lot of people tell me like, oh, I want to hear both sides of the story. Why do you want to hear the wrong side? Like, why do you want to hear wrong information and try to reconcile that with correct and balanced information? You're always going to be confused about this topic. And if you've been following people for a long period of time and you've been learning about this topic for a long period of time, and you don't have like clarity around this topic and you don't feel confident about your nutrition, you're getting information from the wrong people. Like you shouldn't have to learn about it for 10 years and still be confused. That means that you're listening to podcasts that are promoting sensational ideas. You're listening to individuals who are not giving a balanced approach towards things, and you're always going to be getting these competing messages. And it pains me to see people so confused all the time. And pretty much everybody I work with is like so confused all the time because of these, because of this social media misinformation. And because like, if you don't quiet all of that noise and just stick to a few quality evidence-based sources, you're oftentimes going to have all of these different messages where one person's saying that eggs are like cigarettes and the other person is saying eggs are the greatest superfood in the world. And then you're like, well, I don't know what to do. Like you go to the grocery store, you don't know if you should buy eggs or not because one person told you it's like smoking 7 cigarettes, and then like I said, the other person's like eggs are nature's perfect food, and it's like both of these people are lying. Like they're both taking it too far in the extreme, and they're doing that for attention. And by you giving them attention, you're helping them to lie to other people. Like that's the part that frustrates me, is like when people do this, you're helping them lie to other people, and this just continues to perpetuate here on social media.
Now, talking about eggs, I have a question about it. So, I recently posted something about eggs and cholesterol, and people got a little bit extreme in some
Yeah.
cases, and others just too excited about it. So, in your stance and in your understanding, and obviously your recommendation, what is the thing with the cholesterol and eggs? How many eggs are too many to eat in one day?
This is where it goes back to genetics and underlying metabolic health. So for some individuals, eating more eggs and that increased cholesterol is going to lead to more LDL cholesterol in their blood because of genetics or because of metabolic dysfunction or poor metabolic health. And for them, eggs may not be, although they're a nutritious food, they may be, because eggs provide, micronutrients and choline, and, eggs provide a lot of nutrition and high quality protein source. Like they're great for a lot of reasons, but in certain individuals, they may contribute to that, rise in LDL cholesterol. And what we see on a population level, because on a population level, we're most people aren't in great metabolic health or anything like that. Eating a couple of eggs may be associated with maybe a slight increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and some studies have shown like slight increased risk of mortality as well with higher egg consumption. But like I said, I think that this is person specific. So if your LDL cholesterol is fine and you're eating eggs on a regular basis and your risk factors are fine, don't worry about it. But if you have a high LDL level and that's something that needs to be managed, then you may need to restrict your egg consumption a little bit, because that's going to help in many cases. Let's say you were eating 2 or 3 eggs a day and you had high LDL, well, cutting that down to eating 2 eggs a couple times a week, that alone will likely reduce LDL cholesterol for you. So for those, I don't like to give very generic, like, everyone should eat this many eggs a day. I think in those cases that has to be an individual decision based on your own risk factors and understanding, the cholesterol and saturated fat in the eggs. That combination can slightly increase LDL cholesterol if you're consuming, a high amount of eggs. So that's where, just understanding what the risk of consuming eggs is, you might increase LDL cholesterol a little bit. Same with unfiltered coffee, same with a lot of other foods. And then the benefits of eating eggs, you're getting a high quality protein source, you're getting choline, B vitamins, and other nutrients like that. That for many people, if your LDL is fine, then the benefits outweigh the risks. But if your LDL is high, then you may want to look for other protein sources and other sources of nutrition that are going to help lower your LDL cholesterol.
I totally agree. But I think it's also important to look at the overall diet quality and what is the diet composition in terms of like how much, like if the only source of fat you're eating is the eggs, because you're probably eating most of the rest of the foods are fibers and protein and very lean proteins, probably the concern about eating a couple of eggs every day is very minimal in terms of the risk. And especially if you add to it that someone is very active, is a strength training, is lean, has no problem overweight or obesity. So again, it's looking at the entire picture before you actually say whether eating eggs is bad for you or not. Is very individual. And even like looking at the composition, like you can still have eggs, but maybe you may not have 7 whole eggs, but you could have 1 or 2 whole eggs and the rest egg whites and still get the good amount of protein you're getting from the eggs and the quality of the variety of different nutrients that the egg yolk has, but obviously being a bit more cautious about the amount of fats in total that you're consuming per day. And again, if that is a little amount of extra fat you're getting, but the rest of your diet is very low in fat, I don't see much of a risk just by having a bit more eggs overall. I guess the risk could be increased if you were following perhaps a keto diet or a very high fat diet, and a good amount of your fats are coming from saturated fats, and on top of that you're eating a huge amount of eggs and ghee and margarine and all of these things. But again, it comes down to the overall quality of your diet and the composition that entails, on top of looking at your lifestyle, your exercise, and your habits.
Yeah, your underlying metabolic health is probably one of the biggest factors that determines whether or not your LDL goes up when you're eating, slightly more saturated fat. So like if your underlying metabolic health is fine, like, I mean, most people don't really need to be concerned about that. But like you said, if you're eating eggs in the morning with steak and butter, and you're doing that multiple times a day, where you're having steak for lunch and then butter, you're drenching your food in butter for dinner, that's when your overall saturated fat, the overall saturated fat in your diet can increase. And that's where, for some people, it can cause these massive rises in LDL cholesterol, which can really be problematic.
I agree. Okay, how are you with time? I know we're slightly over an hour. I have one more question,
We're good.
But I don't know whether it is going to be too long, because it's about seed oil and inflammation.
Let's address it. My son's playing video games. He hasn't bothered me yet, so I think we're good.
Okay, so the last one is, as I mentioned, seed oils. And there is an ongoing debate at the moment with omega-6 fatty acids, canola oil, and these oils that are coming from like vegetables and seed oils. Are they really an issue? Are they really dangerous for your health? They promote chronic inflammation. What is your stance on this?
So when we conduct studies where scientists have done this dozens of times already, where they give people canola oil or soybean oil or any other type of seed oil, and they look at the effects of consuming that oil, what we find is that they don't increase inflammation at all, not relative, like even if it's being like, they just don't increase inflammation, and they may actually reduce inflammation relative to like high saturated fat sources like butter. There was actually an acute study that I shared a couple of months ago where for the couple of hours after that meal, inflammatory markers went up after someone ate butter, relative to the canola oil group. And it's like the complete opposite of what people are telling people is like, oh, canola oil is inflammatory and butter is a good alternative. Like that study showed the exact opposite. On when we feed people these oils over a period of time, there's no increase in inflammation. And when we feed them these oils in replacement for saturated fat sources, we see a reduction in LDL cholesterol, which we would expect to translate over the course of a lifetime to a reduction in cardiovascular disease risks. So these oils are not an issue. The issue with them is they're put into a lot of highly processed foods. And so in the United States, over the last 40 years, we've consumed a significantly higher proportion of oil overall, particularly coming from these seed oils. So that's where it looks scary, and you can make a good case of like, we've eaten a lot more seed oils and people are, gaining more weight and things like that. But the reality is we just eat more processed foods. They're put into processed foods because they're palatable, they're cheap, and they're easy to incorporate into a lot of processed foods. So is the issue there? There's no evidence that they increase inflammation. There's all the evidence points towards, they're probably one of the better sources of oil. I'm a big fan of olive oil, but seed oils are another, like olive oil and canola oil, they're probably both some of the better sources of oil for us to consume. One caveat that I want to give here, though, and I always give this, is I don't recommend consuming a lot of oils anyway. Like, I don't recommend, unless you're trying to gain weight, like, you shouldn't really be like eating a whole bunch of oil. So the type of oil that you use, even if you want to use butter or whatever, like, isn't a big deal, because you shouldn't be eating a lot of it in the first place, or I don't recommend eating a lot of it in the first place unless you're trying to gain weight. In my opinion, like, the way that I see oil is kind of like, you want to use it, of course, like in your cooking as you need it, but like, it's a concentrated source of calories, just like sugar, the concentrated source of carbohydrates. The most concentrated source of carbohydrates that we can get is sugar. Like, same thing with oil. Oil is just a concentrated source of fat. And we don't necessarily want to just be eating these isolated fat sources, outside of, eating actual whole foods that contain these fat sources, like nuts and seeds and things like that. So that's where I always want to give that caveat, because if you're not eating a lot of these oils in the first place, and you're not eating a whole bunch of added fat in the first place, it doesn't matter that much where it's coming from. And if you are eating a lot of it, then that's probably the thing that needs to be addressed, as opposed to the type is the amount. And honestly, a lot of people, that's a big deal, because a lot of people have never tracked their actual, like, how much they're putting into meals. And I've seen a lot of people, I've cooked with people, I've worked with clients where they're like, oh my God, I tracked the amount of oil that I put into my meal, and I could not believe, I was adding 350 calories to my meal because I was just, going like this with the olive oil. That's going to be an issue more than the type of oil that you eat. So to me, quantity is most important. Go ahead.
I do have a question though. Ratio between omega-3s and omega-6. Is this important at all? Or again, we're kind of driving into the minutiae of dogmatic about
it is important, but for the reason that people think it is. It's so weird. Like, this was important 20 years ago, or like we thought it was important in the scientific community. Like, scientists thought this was important 20 years ago. Like, okay, omega-6 to omega-3 ratio seems to be, a factor. But really what it came down to was, it's just omega-3. Like, the ratio is driven by omega-3 consumption, because everyone's eating a lot of omega-6. And what happened was that, we're actually, what they were detecting was omega-3 status. So now that there's a thing called the omega-3 index that you can do. It's a blood test that'll look at your status of omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DHA. That seems to be the primary factor that was important, and not the omega-6s. It's just the omega-3s. And when you're eating more omega-3s, it reduces the ratio, but it wasn't what we found was that restricting omega-6s didn't have any benefit. It was really just only messing with one side of that ratio that mattered. And so the ratio matters because omega-3 matters, not because omega-6 matters. And you can put an omega be to anything ratio, and it would matter because omega-3 is important, not because of the omega-6.
100%. I love this conversation, and I'm 100% sure everyone enjoyed and learned a lot from all of these topics. Is there any projects you've got in mind? You're cooking anything?
Projects, I have a program coming up soon, like a group program that I'm running for. It's just helping people like simplify this stuff. Like I don't have it, like I call it building healthy habits program. It's like, our clients are, the goal is to really help simplify this stuff and get all this confusion out the way, focus on the things that matter, because the things that matter, it's really simple. Like there's only like 6 or 7 things that really matter in terms of your health. And if you can learn how to focus and get consistent with those, like that is what is going to lead to long-term health. Consistency with the things that matter, not avoiding seed oils or artificial sweeteners or any other little, detail that people get really hung up on these days.
I agree 100%. I Adrian, it was awesome to talk to you. And this is going to be here left on my feed and on your feed as well. And we're going to put this in YouTube very soon, so everyone can go and watch it in any platform if they need to. I hope you are well. You had a good night, suppose, and I'll have a good day. And I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye.
Bye bye.